Welcome everyone. Today we introduce Dr. Kaizhong Gao from Argonne National Lab. He's currently a principal scientist and group leader in Argonne National Lab and a senior fellow at Northwestern University and previous CTO in IBT, which is International Business Technology Service. And he's going to talk about how to define a digital universe. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks you. Yeah, thanks. So this is the title of my talk. My name is Kaizhong. So let's start with everybody using this kind of slide, right? We talk about for 10 years change, how the amount of data change our world, right? So for 10 years, now everybody have cell phone, have tablet, they record everything and upload everything to the cloud, right? We go back to the fundamental storage technology. We like to see a little bit different view angle about how we define the data, how we define the digital universe. Then we go back to see how we look at, from our perspective, what kind of data storage technology we need moving forward in the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, so we go back to the data, the projected amount of data from the IDC, right? This is a kind of several years old, but the projection is every year we get about a 30% data increase. And this is the amount of data that we actually need to store. So by 2020, people project about 40 billion zettabyte of data. So at least until right now, over the past 10 years, this trend is almost following the same way. We have not seen any of the slowdown yet, right? So when we actually look at this, how we define the digital universe, right? So when we talk about digital world, we talk about the amount of data that we actually created. So we generated and stored and utilized. We can use typically categorized into for computation, for storage, and for communications, right? So when we talk about this, we use the basic units of bits to measure that, and then we mapping this technology, and by mapping to the fundamental physics units like a time, like and like a length, we define the bit per second for communication and bit per square inch for the storage. Okay, so now let's look at, right? The time and length are basic units for the physical world. And in order to define the physical world, we have 7 basic units and people use. How about the digital universe, right? Historically, when we talk about the bit, right, we said it's a basic unit for information, mostly based on the definition people posted, and you can actually see they talk about computing and communication. So people heavily putting those definitions in those words, but most of the time they miss the storage part, right? This is all right when we talk about this different definition, but we want to add what does that mean when we including the storage aspect. So let's look at a little bit, right? When we add in the storage aspect, right? Instead of having bit and mapping with a time, or the frequency, we have bit per second and bit per square inch to define anything related to the communication and the storage. Now, as all the data migration to the cloud, what we find out is we want to add in another data property definition, where we give them the definition called the data temperature. That is the new definition we try to put for the digital data property. So that is a specific tailored towards the cloud data storage. So what is exactly that definition, right? So that is the only formula I'm going to show today, which is the data temperature formula, which is shown here, right? So the temperature of data in here, we try to define, we take 10 times log based on 10 for the file access frequency. And then file access frequency typically is just defined by the number of access divided by the time, right? The time, most of the people define as a second. And so you can actually using that, if we choose the unit of time to be 1 year. That means we're adding a constant here. Then we can find a universal linear response of, in the x-axis logarithmic of number of cells per second. The y-axis is actually the temperature defined by the degree G, right? So why are we using this specific unit and specific formula, right? In the next page, we are going to see you have some very interesting aspect that can actually mapping people's understanding about the physical world. If you pick as a typical data storage device like hard drive, right? The highest RPM hard drive goes by 1500 RPM, 15,000 RPM. So they, on average, can access the data about 300 times per second. When you're using this formula, that's corresponding to the highest temperature capability of the data temperature, about 100 degrees. That's mapping to our physical world, feeling about a hot and boiling temperature. When we talk about the average people using their laptop, or you have daily work meetings, you access your data a few times a day. And that's getting back, using this data temperature back to about 25 degrees, which is exactly mapping to about room temperature value. And then people using this to say, hey, what if I try to store my data? I use maybe once a year, family photos, right, tax result. Those getting back to about 0 degree. That's exactly the freezing, the zero temperature. That's freezing freezing the water, right? And then you can further extend, right? If you look at all of this, you can see, hey, for this definition, on one aspect, you talk about all the data storage technology. You talk about DRAM, you talk about the flash, you talk about HDD, you talk about Blu-ray and tape. They actually can all mapping in this bar and all mapping in the same chart. And you can see exactly each different hardware technology, how they corresponding to different capability to handling input and output and rewrite of the data. And when you actually look at the first digital data ever created, and stored in the first generation of hard drive by 1956, if those data have never been read back, that is corresponding to the temperature of your freezer at home. That is minus 18 degrees, right? So this definition is not only very interesting to mapping to the average people's daily feeling, but also they have a lot of impact, right? So on the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about a little bit about how does that impact in terms of the data storage technology, and then look at how does that impact and what kind of future technology solution may exist, right? And then at the same time, we are also trying to see what's a digital universe evolution, how does this compare to the physical universe, and how does this compare to our human society evolution, okay? So before we're doing everything like that, and the primary reason we give this definition is by trying to help people to have better definition when they do their business, right? So one of the reasons is this temperature definition will give this a very accurate prediction or a description about how you charge your cloud service, right? So this is where the money goes. If you look at all the IT cloud service provider, right? Typically it says, oh, I give you a service. You can have this X amount of the data storage. And typically, a lot of time they say this X amount of data storage is for free. What they charge is actually how many gigabyte or terabyte of data you can access. And those is come from the random manner. So they talk about this bandwidth, which is actually corresponding to or proportional to your data temperature. So every different company using the different terms, but there is no universal rules. By putting the digital data temperature definition, we can give them a universal definition. Okay, so let's look at how does that map to the hardware technology, right? This is one of the roadmap from HDD industry. You can actually see a different technology helping to improve the areal density. The projected roadmap is trying to have the areal density keep increase at around 30%. And if you using that projection compared to the SSD, you can see solid state memory actually grows at a slightly higher rate. But when you actually look at the volumetric density, right, the HDD NAND-based storage product and the tape, they are roughly at about the same volumetric density. So why people sell these different products at drastically different price? That's because the assessed or the frequency for doing input-output is drastically different. That's corresponding to the data temperature difference, right? So the actual amount of data is stored is not as important as compared to how high the temperature you can tolerate in terms of data temperature, right? So another interesting aspect is if you look at all this data storage technology, particularly, for example, like HDD, the actual areal density capability has slowed down. So that means now as we try to pack more data, we have to build more hardware, right? If you look at over the last 50, 60 years, this is actually the average seek time for the hard disk drive. You can see at the very beginning, they start to drop, but since the introduction of the personal hard drive, and all of this access time is plateaued and flat at around 10 milliseconds. On the other hand, areal density keep increase. So as soon as the average seek time become flat, your time to spend to write a full disk, full drive start to going up. It's going up almost like linearly, right? So this also means that it takes more time to put more data on the same drive. So if you try to access all this file at the same time, you realize you are experiencing longer delay. That means the average data temperature of the drive will start to drop as you have more files on there. So we run the standard simulation. What we really find is, regardless how you assume, number of users, number of access, ultimately what you find is if you pick any given storage device here, then you increase the amount of access, and then you increase the amount of data you store. You just keep packing more and more files there. And as you grow the number of files stored on that device, what you find is the average temperature of that drive start to drop. That means you have more files there, but you have limited bandwidth to do the read-write operation. So on average, each file can be accessed. That frequency start to drop. And if you think about all the storage device we ever created and we ever put in service as one big device, what you can find is over the past 20 years, the digital universe, the amount of data keep increase at 30% per year that we stored. The amount of the files keep increase about the similar ratio, but the bandwidth doesn't increase as much. That's why you also see the monotonic decrease of the whole digital universe. So you can see this is the same trend for the hard disk drive, as well as you can use the same analysis for all different other technologies. So when we look at our different ways of using the data, right? You can see from the 1950s to 1980s, primarily all this data is in enterprise space. People only in the large business can afford to have that. Then you get to the PC era, and then every family start using and having their data stored in their own home. And then after year 2000, we start to migrate to cloud. People start to store more information over the cloud. Until now, lots of families don't even store much information in their local storage device. So as this change, what's really happening is there is a fixed number of users for a long time, but as you migrate to the cloud, each storage device in the Google server, in Amazon server, start to have to host data from many different users. And this goes very rapidly. And so what that happens is that's actually creating a different requirement in terms of the data temperature. So this blue line is actually an illustration of the hard disk drive capacity over the last 25 years. you can actually see the hard disk drive actually increased at about 43% per year in terms of capacity until last year. Okay, I don't have the new data for this year yet, but so far until last year, for last 30 years, it's almost 43% per year. And you can see, as we migrate to the cloud, the file size doesn't necessarily increase by a lot. So what you really see is the number of files on the right-hand side also, the number of files go monotonically with the drive capacity. And the average data temperature of the drive start to drop, simply because you take the same amount of time, you randomly select to read and write data, but now you have to go over a lot more files, right? This is the case that even 10 years ago, people here at Google already found out. It become a problematic because you guys viewing that hard disk drive become an archive solution rather than actually real-time service solution, right? So this is nothing new, right? But when we actually look at this, is typically the average data temperature of a drive and its peak temperature value is different. They can be varied by as much as 40, 50 degrees. When you look at 40 to 50 degrees, that means you're talking about a 5 order of magnitude difference. The reason that people can tolerate that is because in reality, when we're using the hard drive for the data storage or using any of the storage device, what we really have is we only have very tiny percentage of files which are hot, which we need very frequent access. We pay 99% of our money for the data we very infrequently to access them. But think about it, right? When we put the service, we charge our customer by the frequency of access. So that is where we're making the money, right? So in that regard, when we're putting this into the cloud data storage, our current storage scheme is very inefficient because we use a high cost, more expensive hardware solution, store a lot of data we almost never use, right? But on the other hand, that also means because these things exist, therefore we can use the low data temperature capability hardware setup to make a complex service because it's very hard to predict which particular piece of information becomes so hot that need a lot more frequent access, right? But here is the thing. When you actually increase the file size, you can actually slow down this data temperature drop, data temperature capability drop, right? So as we move forward a little bit, right? When we look at the HDD and SSD, if this is an average data temperature capability of hard disk drive, we know that as people migration to the cloud, you have more user now, right? So even you have small percentage of data need high temperatures, have high temperature, but since you have more users, so the number of frequency, number of access still increase. So what they want is the actual demand start creeping up as you have more user to access the same storage device. But at the same time, because as your capacity increase, your data temperature capability drop, therefore what you really have seen is the gap between the market demand as well as your hardware capability become larger and larger. That gap will be fulfilled by a new technology. So in the past 10 years, solid state drive start to occupy high-end hard disk drive market. It's because of this particular reason, right? So it's not saying, oh, they take over hard disk drive market. It's because hard disk drive can no longer fulfill the new requests from the market, right? Because of the migration to the cloud. So as we can see, right, 5, 10 years later, right, we probably have more centralized storage, right? Have more users try to access certain set of data. That means you need even higher data temperature capability at the device level. So that is where the new emerging technology can potentially come in and start to taking over some of the high-end SSD space, right? So let me skip this. So now let's look at a little bit different, from a different angle to look at this, right? if we think the whole universe is one big gigantic drive, right? We know that the total amount of data monotonically increase. So this is the whole digital universe. We only have one drive, but we have all the possible way to access the data, right? And we know that if we increase the amount of data faster than the bandwidth that we can actually retrieve the data or to do the read-write operation, there is a monotonic relation. The data temperature keeps dropping, right? You have more data, you create it, you host it, you have more requests, but the ratio keeps dropping. Therefore, your data temperature start dropping. If you compare that to the physical world, you see a very similar things, right? After the Big Bang, right now as we detect our universe, we find all the galaxies starting moving away faster from us, right? We know the universe is expand. One of the direct evidence is when we measure the actual physical temperature of the universe, the background radiation temperature start to dropping, right? It's dropping over time, right? So this follow the similar path, right? There are a lot of similarities between all these large-scale systems, right? When we look at this aspect, look at a little bit about as we migrate to the cloud, how the behavior of the cloud service versus how the human society evolution, right? So there is another aspect very interesting. When we have just a small amount of people, right? People create a village, right? They live in isolated spots, so they try to build a very small path. People work to each other and connect to each other. And at the very beginning, we have the PC, everybody having their own storage unit. Then they try to have a cable connect to each other. And then 10 years later, right, then people, the society start quit. We start to build town. Then we start to have multi-family house. People are living closer to each other. More high, wider road is built. And in the storage space, we try to put the drive together. We try to put the storage server. We try to have them to host the data that have multiple people or tens or hundreds of people access. That's enterprise storage server. Another 10 years later in our digital world, right, we try to have the cloud. When you look at human society, people concentrate more, population density getting higher. You start to building skyscraper, right? You have all of these multi-family home, condos, and in the Google and Facebook, right? You guys building all of this, right? The concentration of drives, the density of drives getting to a much higher level, right? So when you compare this kind of larger scale system, you see a lot of similarity in between, right? So given said that, right, we can learn from each other, right? We have a lot of smart way to manage our data center, but we can also see, oh, there might be some problem that a human society is facing, our physical universe is facing, that can map into our digital world, right? Which is something we need to anticipate those things happening and finding the solution, right? One of the very simple example, we talk about data archive system. On the hardware side, right? Because for the archive system, you want the lowest cost solution. So anything, the cost below the hard disk drive, Blu-ray and tape, right? So those are the examples of their data archive system. So they talk about, still we have $1 billion market, and we primarily host the data that's lower than 10 degree G. The 10 degree is roughly about, you access the data as once per month or lower frequency, okay? In reality, most of the people putting in their data in the archive system, at the data they actually expect, they hope they never need to access them, right? That's why they try to drive the lowest cost. So here is the scenario, right? When you actually look at all this data, you still want them to be really reliable. They can keep the data for a long time. They have low cost for long-term maintenance, and they hopefully to be rewritable. Well, the Blu-ray is not truly rewritable. So why I try to highlight rewritable is an important aspect, right? So when we look at from storage perspective, right? People talk about, oh, I take this file offline, right? Or versus I remove the data, I delete the data, I erase the data, I completely erase the data. These have all different meaning, right? A lot of people using those terms exchange to each other, and they don't differentiate them. But to me, to the people who is working on the storage industry, they have a lot of different interpretation, right? So even when we talk about erase data, there are two different ways, right? Lots of times in the cloud space, right, you store your data, you archive your data. When you actually remove them, what you do is, a lot of them have index file. You compress in a large file, you remove their index or security key. So Blu-ray, tape, and HDD, they're all using this method, right? But in reality, right, that piece of information is still physically residing in that location. There is, no way to change it unless you have other approach to make a modification to it, right? So on the other hand, when you're actually doing the physical removal of the data, that means you're actually writing another information, changing the state of that hardware so that it represents something else, right? So in that case, the current approach for Blu-ray have a lot of limitation because typically they will write once on media. And tapes, in theory, you can do that. And in theory, you can do that many, many times. But practically speaking, you have a lot of limitation because tape, you have to physically find in your library, finding a particular tape, get into your drive and rewind for a long time, find your location and take the file out, right? Then after you remove a particular file, you need to compress the rest of the file, putting them back, right? So removing one data there taking a long time, right? On hard disk drive, well, it's typically manageable. You're talking about a microsecond. We can make that done, right? So when we look at can this be done, is this feasible, is this practical? Well, people can say, hey, from hardware perspective, we can clearly see the differentiation. But why we need to do that? Why we shouldn't, think we can skip this, right? So let me pick one example, right? So typically, large IT company, for example, I know like Facebook, they were very highlight about the Blu-ray-based storage archive system. And then I think Amazon using a lot on their tape to do their archive for the Glacier storage, right? So these are the two primary very low-cost solutions. I think Google using a lot on the drive-based, but you guys probably also still using quite a bit on the tape side as well. So what's really happening is you compare a lot of information to this system, but by the time, for example, somebody getting to a really important event, they want to remove 30,000 email. They scattering randomly in the cloud, right? What you really see is the steps for writing those information into your archive system follow a very similar steps. It doesn't have a lot of overhead for time and effort and cost. But when you actually try to physically remove something, right, 30,000 email random scattering in the cloud, all these three different technologies have to go through completely different steps. And generally speaking, when you actually talk about physically remove those information, assuming only one copy or 30,000 files scattered in the cloud, it takes about 2 months for actually taking one tape or archive system to remove them. It takes about 40 years if you assume 100 drives running in parallel to do it, to remove the Blu-ray. And it takes about 8 hours to remove all of this in the hard drive archive system. Okay, those were the kind of comparison when we says. So as we can see, if we think at some point we need to remove unwanted data, and that becomes important, then the choice of the data storage technology may make a huge impact, right? So the next question is, can we or should we, right, be able to actually completely remove the data, right? So there are a lot of arguments, right? On one side, it's dominant the argument say, the data are important. We should never remove them, right? And they also say, there are a lot of field. It's a federal law required. You archive data for 10 years, for 30 years. Those are all the true arguments. On the other side, there are a lot of data actually created invade people's privacy, right? Is there something that should be removed, right? Or, there were data. No data probably will last for, 100 million years, right? Maybe longer than the human society, lifetime, right? So the way we were saying, at some point, certain type of data may be required to remove, right? So all kind of things could happen. So what's really happening is, one thing I want to say is, in reality, even for right now, right, we actually generate a lot more data, and we erase and throw away a lot of data without even actually store them. Those happen a lot in scientific research. Those happen a lot in even our current like autonomous cars that Google is doing. Your sensor can capture a lot more data than you actually collected, right? And in our daily life, right? And everybody taking their kids' photo. But are you sure you actually go back to check every single photo, right? After 10 years or after 20 years, are you also doing that, right? Because eventually it's limited by your own time to see, right? So you want to see the most important one, not every single one, right? The second, when we look at the physical process, everybody processes their data, or how we recognize things, right? In physical world, right? Our eyes, we open, the amount of data coming in, it's a much larger set of information than our brain actually processes, right? So in reality, we don't really to store every information that ever exists, right? And then the third thing is, as we earlier argued, right? The more data you stored, the more space you have, the more files you have, the data temperature capability drop. That means it takes longer time to process them. You want to make sense of that data, it slows you down, right? So in order to compensate that, you have to add in a lot more processing power, adding a lot of cost, a lot of the new hardware and software, new effort together, right? Just in order to eliminate all this redundancy, making the sense of the same set of the data, right? So from DOE perspective, now I join a national lab, they care about the cost, particularly the energy consumption, right? If we store a lot more data and doesn't really use them, that's a big waste. From national perspective, it's a big waste of energy, right? So with all of this, we say, at some point, people may need to consider how we can identify and remove those data, how we can actually physically remove them so that they no longer cost us to holding them. How much they cost, right? Give you one example. This Gao is not just my last name, right? This is actually the Government Accountability Office. They actually check. So from their report, they said the US government actually spent more than 70% of their IT spending maintain those old and legacy systems. As a result, even like last year alone, right? They were having $7.3 billion less investment to the new technology, but they have to move this fund to maintain the very old one, right? Those are the information you store, but some of them still important, but because you have no way to transfer to the new system, but some of them may be obsolete, right? So when we look at Facebook, right, it's a very young company, about 10 years old, right? Right now they have tried to store all the information people ever uploaded there, right? Some of them may be important. Some of them may be less important. But what will happen 10 years later, right? What will happen 20 years later, right? So those data have to be put in somewhere in their data archive system. Let's say you put in the Blu-ray, right? 5 years later, you find 5% of data may no longer need it. You have no way physically remove them. What you do, you let them sit there. 10 years later, that becomes 15%, right? So as the time aggregate, right? At some point, I realize, majority data are not that important anymore, right? So at some point, there is a trigger point. So if you don't find a solution where you can actually easily replace those unwanted data with the new data, it's become a, drive up all your costs, right? So let's make another comparison, right? When we look at these things, we talk about those unwanted data. We said, in the digital world, right, that's also corresponding to the garbage, right? we talk about we have a garbage, we have recyclable, we have non-recyclable, right? For things you cannot remove, it's like a non-recyclable garbage. It sits there forever, take your space, pollute your environment, and take your resources, but doesn't provide anything good. For things you can remove, that become a recyclable stuff, right? You decompose, you can overwrite with new information. So as we migrate to the cloud, now we concentrate a lot more data. That is very similar like, remember the human society, now we have metropolitan, right? This is a city I used to live, right? I grew up there, now they have 20 million people there, right? So you can actually see as the population density grows, right? This is the number of garbage collecting sites surrounding to the city, just in order to maintain the function of the city itself, right? So if we think, if we can actually, making all this to be recyclable, right? The number of sites can be reduced significantly, right? For the same thing, if we have our data center, right? We can better identify and realize, have more amount of data that is actually useful, remove those no longer needed data, replaced by the useful data, then the efficiency of the data center as a whole will be improved, right? So there are a few different ways to do, right? One of the very dumb approach is say, hey, data archive, we replace the hard disk drive, the platter, using that to replace the tape or Blu-ray. At least those are rewritable, right? So of course there are a lot of technical detail the people in the hardware side need to working on. But this is something to get things started, right? In reality, in the data storage industry, there are a lot of ways actually continue reduce the cost by making the rewritable of this data archive system as an option, right? So there are some things that we are currently working on. And on those technology, if we implement, we said we can lower the drive cost to low enough so that they are appealing to the same field that people are currently using tape or Blu-rays. And if you look at, right, what does this mean, right? For the Facebook, I think they were direct benefit because over the time, they are probably seeing the fastest growth of useless data, right, as a percentage of the data they stored. So they don't have to build an additional data center because a lot of these data center, their information can be removed and then can be replenished and restore a new information. And people, company like Seagate, they no longer need shrinking size because now they can build an archive system rather than just hard disk drive, right? And the same thing for WD. Now they can have new product line. And for Amazon, Google, for you guys host a large amount of data. If you guys are using this, you will also realize a lot of saving from both your data center operations, your data archive system, as well as for your service, right? A lot of these different hardware technology, they can provide this kind of service without have to introduce additional cost, right? So the whole society, from our perspective, implementing those things, they will actually lower your energy cost and lower your energy consumption and reduce your carbon dioxide emission, right? So this is, from hardware perspective, we look at how we define the digital universe, how we store the data, and look at what's the future perspective. I think I will stop here. I think these are the backup slide. Basically, this is the summary of my talk. We try to give a standard definition of data temperature, and then using that data temperature to study all the hardware technology. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, here's right now it's a Q&A. Do you have any questions about the talk?
Sure.
Sure. Is this? Come here.
One question I have is normally data, even in active and passive data, so you have redundancies. Nowadays, not only a single copy of data is stored,
Yes.
multiple copies.
Yes.
So do you take that into account in your
Yes.
temperature, data temperature?
Yes. So here is the thing. You can consider every single file you created as independent. When you have multiple data, you basically have a clone of this piece of information. So each individual piece of information now being accessed less frequently, right? So instead, you're keeping one very hot piece of data. Now you're creating multiple low temperature data, right? That's exactly the same thing as we talk about. As you're creating more copy, right? The size of the digital universe expands, right? The temperature drops, right? So the way people in the cloud data storage industry trying to do is, for example, when you have a breaking news, right? Everybody rush in, try to search for some piece of information, right? But regardless what kind of SSD or HDD, they have very limited bandwidth. They cannot keep looking for a couple pieces of information back and forth as an unlimited bandwidth. So they just create more and more copies, right? But the nice thing for that is typically, right, after the short period of time, very hot, much less people start searching for it, right? So they remove those redundancy, right? If you keep all of this information in HDD or SSD, right, you overwrite with other information. That is like you eliminate, recycle those data, right? Recycle those space, right? Eliminate those redundancy. But what happens is, no matter how you do this process, you always try to keep an archive copy, right? The archive copy at the beginning is not a problem. But if our digital universe keeps expanding, right? After 10, 20 years, 30 years, generations, right? The aggregated amount of data become larger and larger, right? So by the time you reach there, now you have to say, oh, at some point, I realize I pay a lot more effort try to keep all of this old data over the past, right? And then you have to make a choice, right? There were things that, think about it, 2 generations before, right? We don't even have all of this digital data definition. People still live fine, right? Of course, now it's better, right? But it doesn't mean you have unlimited data will definitely make you better. Because nowadays, probably more people watching their cell phone more than they actually watching the real life person, right? People go dating. Instead of talking to each other, they do texting, right? That may not be the right thing, right?
Thank you. That
Yeah.
makes sense. My kind of second question is,
Yeah.
so normally as what you make is very applicable to kind of services we provide, but like we as a cloud service provider, sometimes the data return, the data criticality or the data retention, that requirement comes from the customers.
Yes.
Right. So do you have any opportunities there where we can provide this data temperature suggestions to them? Or
Yes. So this is actually the kind of interesting part, right? Because, for example, if I, talk to people like you guys or like Microsoft, when they're sales people, right? When they sell to their customer about cloud service, right? They basically just use that formula, right? You have X amount of terabyte stored in our server. You have this bandwidth, then you pay an amount of money, right? So when those people coming to talking to you, right? In reality, they pay the premium to elevate data temperature capability, right? The catch here is, oh, we go this by logarithmic. So you can basically say, oh, we have a few tiers, right? Changing by 5 degrees, you're changing by double your price, right? This can be easily translated there, right? It's just every company probably using very similar formula, but there was no way to talk to each other to try to standardize them, right? So that is a kind of interesting aspect. That's why I try to use this formula, because I feel like, oh, it's very interesting because people who are not working in the technology side now can exactly correlate this degree to their, daily life, right? But at the same time, when you actually look at cloud service, that's exactly the kind of formula all this company is using.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gao.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting perspective to compare this with actually the real world.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have a follow-up question
Yeah.
to what you talk about. All the companies are already using similar concept, but not standardized yet. How
Yeah.
is the progress of standardizing, and what are the companies' reactions when you bring up this concept?
So, good question. So, the standard was a formula that I present before you just come. So it's actually in an earlier slide where you can see. I just started to publishing this a few months ago. Start talking to the people. It is a very interesting aspect because in reality, right, every company, they just need to have a formula they show it to their customer, right? So on practical aspect, if they think they can sell to their customer, probably that's good enough, right? But for the people working on the storage side, particularly last couple of years, I start to looking at, I used to be working for Seagate, the hard drive company, right? Looking at one set of data storage technology. But I try to jump outside to look at, hey, how each different technology interact with each other. So for example, why SSD taking over some of the market on HDD over the past few years, right? So I try to say, hey, is there some universal relation there, right? Then I realized, hey, people in the IT industry, they have this discrepancy, right? They all follow the similar trend, but nobody really tried to put something there. So I hope that people will start buying this. And so I'm starting to try to press all different data storage company to start using something like this. Last year, when I first presented at the magnetic recording conference, it was very interesting because normally only hard drive company go to those conference. But I do see people from Verizon, Facebook, and I'll go there and listen to that talk. So hopefully they will feel like, oh, this is interesting. And I think if we get more, because I myself is from hardware side, right? From storage industry. If I get more opportunity to talk to the people in the cloud space, right? Or maybe in open compute, right, space, a lot of these people will be able to start to adapt to it. I definitely think that's very useful because if you look at in storage industry, right, we have all these different technology from tape, Blu-ray, hard disk drive, solid state, DRAM, and we have a lot of emerging technology of spin RAM, flash, and the RRAM, phase change, 3D crosspoint, all of this, right? But now with one formula, right, all of them just falling within the same chart, right? We talk about the 160 degree, you cover everything included in data storage technology, right? Nothing go outside this boundary right now, right? So this is something make it, very attractive. Because people are interested in the hardware side, they're interested what kind of new technology or new design or new approach we can have to take a new market, right? Take a market currently have, right? My starting point is that you never really argue some technology take over the other technology market. Your rationale should be, oh, there is a new market. What is the best technology for that, right? So if you have the same solution, right, to meet the same market, then always the lowest cost one win. But people have a diversity of need, right? As you migrate to cloud, actually some of these criteria become more well-defined. So that's easier for people to look at this evolution. So that's why you see the SSD is booming for the last few years, right? But the SSD taking over high-end hard disk drive is not because the SSD taking that. It's more expensive. It's because the demand for that particular cloud service require high data temperature capability, which hard drive actually creating more gap nowadays as your capacity increase, right? So you lose that market by yourself. It's not other technology taking over. So that is where my standpoint.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you for being here, and it was a nice time. Thank you.
Thanks.